A couple of months ago, my Instagram friends voted on this video to be made, so here we are. I intend to give you some guidance about the best finishing techniques for doll clothing. This is not an exhaustive list, but I hope it gives you a lot of options once you start sewing clothes for your little doll. We will start by deciding what makes more sense. Therefore, I shall start with the simplest way to finish your seams, which is using pinking shears. Pinked seams. Pinking shears, for those who have never heard this term before, are sewing scissors with a tooth edge so that when you cut fabric with them, it cuts little triangles, giving you two bias edges that won't unravel as much as if you cut the fabric with regular scissors. In my opinion, pinking shears are a perfectly acceptable way to finish seam allowances on doll clothing, as well as for very small lengths of seams or very small doll clothing. They reduce bulk, and if the clothes will not be played with or handled a lot, why not use them? I personally don't use them as much, except for inside seams that won't be seen, because I like to have a more polished look on the inside of my doll's clothing, but I want you to know that this is a perfectly sensible way of finishing your doll clothing. Zig-zag seams. The normal thought continuation of using pinking shears to finish a seam is to then use a zigzag stitch to finish the raw edges when you do cut straight with your regular scissors or if you don't have pinking shears. In my opinion, this is also very acceptable, especially when using knits that won't unravel as much. There's nothing wrong with using the zigzag stitch of your sewing machine to finish those raw edges. One way to do this is to sew a zigzag stitch on all the edges before assembling the piece. The other is to sew them together once you have made the assembly seams, as if you were using a serger to finish the raw edges. Play with this technique and see if you like the look and how the clothes end up looking after a couple of washes. I use zigzag edges on doll underwear, socks, undershirts, and sometimes on small lengths of shoulder seams, etc. French seams. Now, I wasn't sure why these were called French seams, as my French friends don't call them like that. But I did find this from Madame Sew, a highly recommended website if you're into sewing. The French seam is thought to have originated in France during the 16th century, when the country was known for its fine tailoring and dressmaking. At the time, French seamstresses used this technique extensively in their work to create a clean and elegant finish to their garments. Today, the French seam is still widely used in the fashion industry and in home sewing, and its name continues to reflect its origins in French dressmaking. I recommend French seams when doing straight seams and with lightweight fabrics. With heavier fabrics, I believe this type of seam creates too much bulk, especially when sewing small doll clothes. To sew a French seam, you first place your fabrics wrong sides together and make a wider than usual seam. Then you cut both seam allowances in half, press the seam, and now with both right sides together, you make another seam, enclosing the freshly cut raw edges within the seam. So effectively, you are sewing twice, giving an extremely sturdy and high-quality finish to your seams. These so-called French seams floats freely inside the garment, and it's great, as I mentioned, for doll garments sewn with lighter fabrics. Flat fill seam. Now, this is almost the same thing, except that instead of cutting both raw edges, you only cut one in half, and the other seam allowance is then folded over it to enclose the raw edges, and then you sew it down. It gives you 2 rows of beautiful stitching on the right side and a completely finished look on the inside. This is an extremely sturdy seam to avoid bulk inside clothing, normally used for workwear or jeans. If you do it by hand, you would only have very, very tiny, unnoticeable stitches on the right side. I like flat fell seams on several areas, and when done by hand, I like to make them on the sleeves. I also use them when sewing overalls or jeans for my dolls. You can also make a mock flat fill seam, but we won't talk about that one since we're actually discussing how to finish doll clothing in a beautiful way. Now, so far, the pinked and zigzag seams were well with straight or curved seams, while French seams and flat fill seams work best with straight seams. What about curves? Well, for curved seams such as in calves, collars, and hems, I like to use hand-roll hem seams or bound seams. A hand-roll hem is a beautiful and heirloom-appropriate way to finish edges on your doll clothing, such as cuffs, hems, collars, straps, ruffles, or ties. It is particularly stellar to use it with lightweight fabrics. I love using it with my linens. The way to do this seam is to make a little double fold and carry on by doing a sort of zigzag stitch by hand, though it can also be done in the sewing machine using a rolled hem foot. The issue with hand-roll hems is you end up with a little rolled at the edge. The sewing machine flattens the fold, and while it looks beautiful, it's not the same look. Perhaps you like one over the other or appreciate the ease of using the sewing machine. I will stick with my hand-rolling hems for now, as I love those chubby rolls at the ends of doll sleeves or on little bloomer legs. Bound seams with bias tape. This is a brilliant way to finish your seams and one I have used from my very humble beginnings before I had a serger. You can use a commercial double-folded bias tape or single fold, or you can make your own by cutting bias strips that can match, complement, or enhance the inside of your doll's clothing. For example, I like using floral fabrics as bias strips to finish more dull solid colors, like raw linen or jeans fabric. I also like to use the same fabric as in the main garment for an all-encompassing look, or lighter fabrics when I'm trying to reduce bulk when using heavy fabrics for the main garment construction. You can play with this so much, and it's a great way to finish your seams exceptionally well on curves, as the bias can be shaped to the curves with your iron. The way to use it is first you make your seam. If you're trying to enclose raw edges on a straight seam, you can do a Hong Kong seam. If you're trying to use it as a facing, you first sew the tape or strip right sides together, then fold it over the raw edge and sew it to the opposite side. You will see this seam from the front, but it should look neat, like a second row of stitching from the first made seam. This technique works wonders to attach collars to necklines and then enclose all raw edges, to finish arm-size seams, straight seams, pocket seams, you name it. It can add a little bit of bulk, and that is why you should always use very lightweight fabrics for the bias tape. Whipped seams. Now, this one doesn't actually form part of that garment construction, but it is completely done in service of tending the raw edges of your fabric. You can either use a whip stitch and leave the seam allowances floating on the inside of the garment, or attach them to the garment with very tiny stitches, trying to make them as invisible as possible when seen from the front. I think whipped seams can add such a decorative look while also being practical. All those stitches are holding the weave of your fabric in place, securing more threads so that your seam allowances don't unravel with use and washings. Serged seams. Finally, the quintessential modern way to finish seams. Using a handy serger to do lots of stitching on the raw edges. We're all very accustomed to seeing this finish on our clothing, so I guess it's what most people expect when they also open doll clothing for inspection. The reason I like using the serger to finish my doll clothing seams, aside the ease, is because I use a lot of linen and I also use a lot of repurposed knits. Using the serger helps me immensely with these two types of fabrics while also keeping bulk at bay. I have to confess I prefer hand sewing techniques, linings, facings, and all other manner of clever ways to finish the inside of a doll outfit because I feel it pays to put those extra hours of work into such things. First, because it connects you more deeply to your work. Second, because you progress and get better at hand sewing. Third, you appreciate the time it takes to make things well, therefore placing more value on your handcraft and not offering it willy-nilly to anybody. You seek true appreciation from others, and they are rewarded with something beautifully made. Fourth, it slows down your life and your making, which perhaps can then lead to an exploration in mindfulness, in breathing, in taking more time to actually live your life than running from thing A to thing B. And so many more reasons, but I think those are the main ones. So at risk of sounding too woo-woo, I hope you find this video helpful and it gives you a few options to try as you embark on dressing your doll. One of my favorite ways to spend a day or week or two. Wishing you much success in taming seam allowances, steaming, and working with your pressing hams on tailoring beautiful outfits worthy of your dolls. Thanks for watching.